The First Minister has come under increasing pressure over her involvement in the botched contract for two CalMac ferries. They're currently £150 million over budget and 4 years late. Nicola Sturgeon's been accused by former Ferguson Marine owner Jim McCall of rushing through the order of the vessels in 2015 without proper safeguards to maximise publicity ahead of her first-party conference as leader. Well, let's speak to the Finance Secretary, Kate Forbes, who's with us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Can you tell us who gave the go-ahead for these ferries?
Yes, so ultimately this is a question of procurement. CMAL obviously negotiated the procurement with Ferguson Marine, and the Transport Minister at the time would have signed off on the final process. So
Derek Mackay is your answer?
Yes, but I think the important point here, and this is why I'm answering questions on your show several years after this was first agreed, is that the Scottish Government takes collective responsibility. You know, the Audit Scotland report is an independent, in-depth review. It's entirely fair and justified. And the delays, the cost overruns and the impact on island communities are entirely unacceptable. And we take collective responsibility for that.
There is an internal government document that's being reported from August the 20th, 2015 to the then Cabinet Secretary responsible for Transport, Keith Brown, that says, in the absence of the Minister for Transport and the Islands who's on leave, your approval is sought for CMAL to award the shipbuilding contract. So the suggestion there is that Derek Mackay actually wasn't around at that moment.
Well, that document is about the procurement process, which was agreed in August 2015. Now, the Audit Scotland report, which, as I say, is the facts, reports that there were no material problems with the procurement process. It was an internationally recognised contract. In fact, the Audit Scotland report highlights that there was an independent high-level review of that very procurement procedure, and it found that there were no material issues with the procurement. It's
the material issue, though, and the reason that it's important to know who signed this off is because the advice from CMAL and also Transport Scotland was that without financial guarantees, this shouldn't be awarded to Ferguson's.
And that followed several months later. So that's why the facts are really important, far more important than some of the political posturing that we've seen. Because a procurement process is not directed by ministers. So it's independent.
This was signed off by ministers ultimately, though, because the procurement advice from CMAL and Transport Scotland was ignored. Why was it ignored?
So the refund guarantee, now this was a full refund guarantee, emerged several months after Ferguson Marine were identified as the preferred bidder. They were identified as the preferred bidder because they had the highest combined score in terms of cost and quality. Ministers were not involved in identifying them as the preferred bidder, but ministers do ultimately sign off the contract. Now, weeks later, it was identified that due to cash flow issues, Ferguson Marine would not be able to agree to a full refund guarantee. Now, at that point, and I know this procedure well because it's an issue that we have to contend with, mitigations were put in place. So, for example, we ensured that there was an increase in the final payment to Ferguson Marine, that CMAL would take ownership of all equipment, and that all major suppliers would have to offer a full refund guarantee. Now, at that point, it's a question of a balance of risk. If ministers had pulled the plug on the contract at that point, so that's October, after the independent procurement procedure, if we'd pulled the plug at that point, then we would be pulling the plug on two desperately needed new ferries and pulling the plug on a yard that had only recently been bought over.
But dropping the requirement for full repayment guarantees means that ministers at the time, in not pulling the plug, knew that there could be an overspend here, that actually, and they could be left footing the bill, and taxpayers could be left footing the bill, as has happened.
And I would make 2 points. One is that we absolutely have to learn lessons. So all future procurement procedures must include a full refund guarantee. So we're, for example, procuring the Isla ferries right now, and that will include a full refund guarantee. So there's no question that we must have that in place.
So whoever signed this off at the time then made a mistake on that front?
Whoever signed off on the time weighed up the balance of risk. And again, I remind you...
And got it wrong?
Well, obviously, hindsight is a wonderful thing in understanding now.
But it's not just about hindsight, is it? Because you've just explained there the importance of having these guarantees in future. And why wasn't that thought of at the time?
Can I remind you too that the reason for the delays and for the cost overruns are ultimately about construction? The Audit Scotland report is clear that there should have been a full refund guarantee. We accept that, and that will change for future procurement. But ultimately, it's the construction that's ultimately responsible for the delays. That is the root cause here. You look at the most recent delay, that's due to incorrect cabling being installed before the yard was nationalised. These are the issues that the Audit Scotland report unpacks around having sensible data on progress, better communication, more efficient processes. We've learned lessons, but bear in mind the procurement process. The Audit Scotland report says there were no material issues with the procurement process, and in terms of the full refund guarantee, mitigations were put in place. And on that balance of risk, if we pulled the plug on the contract at that point, we wouldn't have proceeded with those two vessels, and the yard, of course, would probably have gone into administration.
But had you pulled it at that point, the people who rely on these ferries may actually be using them now.
The root cause of the delays is the construction. It's not the contractual arrangements. Now, the full refund guarantee is an important issue.
But the other issue is it not that this was actually given the go-ahead when actually the designs hadn't been fully worked out?
Well, and you highlight another important point, which comes back to construction. We're focused here on procurement and refund guarantees. The fundamental problem here was the construction process. We had a private company that won a contract fairly and squarely, and the construction process was inefficient, and Audit Scotland unpacks this further.
And wasn't part of the problem the rush here to announce some good news at your party conference?
I fundamentally disagree with that. And again, I would say if we're serious about learning the lessons of this whole situation, we base that analysis on facts in the independent Audit Scotland report and not the opinions of somebody with vested interest in a Sunday newspaper. The timetable does not stack up. Ferguson was publicly announced as the preferred bidder in August 2015. I think the conference you're referring to was sometime in October. The election wasn't until the following May, and this whole process was months, if not years, in the making.
What will be the final cost here?
Well, I confirmed to Parliament last week that the total direct project cost of delivering the vessels is an estimated range of up to £206 million.
Jim McCall says 400 million potentially.
Well, Jim McCall may say a lot of things. I prefer to base my analysis and my forecasts on the facts.
Does he have any expertise in this?
That's for him to answer and not for me to answer.
So it will not be £400 million?
Well, the latest updated cost forecast is up to £206 million. That takes into account a number of things. It takes into account new warranties, it takes into account the latest schedule, and it takes into account the cabling issue that I've already referred to.
So it will not be £400 million? He's wrong on that?
Well, I have no idea what he has based that on at all. What I've got is my forecasts based on fact.
He also says that it's going to cost more to finish the second vessel, 802, than replace it with a new ferry. So there's a strong argument for not continuing with it in its current form. He says he would make it watertight, launch it, and then sell the hull. Are you looking at that?
Well, can I again remind you of the fact that if we're serious about A, learning the lessons, and B, completing these vessels, we don't base our views on the vested interests of somebody in a Sunday newspaper interview. We base it on...
But what is his vested interest? He's not involved anymore. I mean, he's saying it will cost more to finish this hull than replace it with a new ferry. When it comes to value for money for the taxpayer, should you at least be considering that?
We have got a new chief executive in post at the yard who brings with him 4 decades worth of experience. He has seconded in some individual from CMAL with, again, significant experience. So between CMAL, the new management at the yard and officials, we have a significant body of analysis, of data and of evidence to base our decisions on. And our decision right now is to proceed as fast as possible to complete these vessels for the sake of communities that rely on them.
Are these experts telling you it will cost more to finish 802 than replace it with a new ferry?
These experts are telling me that we should proceed with completing these vessels and that it will cost up to £206.3 million.
So it will cost more to finish this vessel than replace it with a new ferry?
No, that is not what I just said. We have 2 vessels that are sitting there that are making significantly good progress, and our job now is to complete them according to the new schedule.
Just finally, when you talk about learning lessons, should there be an inquiry?
Well, we've had 2 inquiries, as you'll know, the Audit Scotland report as well as the Scottish Parliament committee report. The Audit Scotland report suggests that we should look, after 801 and 802 are completed, at the lessons that have been learned. And I think we'll come back to Parliament with an update on that point. Bear in mind, we're not waiting to learn lessons. The procurement process of the 2 new Isla vessels have incorporated lessons learned. We have a new procedure for interventions in private companies that's been welcomed by Audit Scotland. So progress has been made.
But given the sheer amount of public money that has gone astray here, should there be an inquiry? Do the public not need to know all of the answers to exactly what happened here?
And I think the Audit Scotland report provides a lot of those answers.
A lot of, but not all of them.
And I think we will certainly consider that Audit Scotland recommendation, which is to suggest a formal review of what went wrong. But let's focus right now on what Audit Scotland tells us to focus on, which is completing the vessels. There are communities across our island communities that are dependent on those vessels. My job is to get the vessels completed so that they are serving those communities. And at that point, I think if it's necessary to look back and learn further lessons, we will consider that certainly and report to Parliament.
Finance Secretary Kate Forbes, thank you for your time this morning.